Krewson won the Democratic primary, and I guess by default, she's more or less going to be the next mayor unless something truly remarkable happens and the Republican comes through. But it was interesting to me, and in fact, that Kelly and I were talking about this off air, that this was a much closer race than people were expecting.
Good morning, Doug. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi there.
How you doing? I agree. I think that's the story. I think not just how close it was, but specifically that it was Treasurer Tashara Jones who made it so close. I was at Lyda Krewson's victory party Tuesday night, and there were some nervous folks there once the returns got posted with 85% of the precincts in, and that's when she had really tightened it up. And everybody was just frantically trying to figure out which ward still has to come in, which ward is still having to come in. And at least one of the wards that had to come in at that point was one in which they thought it was going to be close, and it was. And less than 1,000 votes. The election does two things. One, Lyda Krewson is going to be the next mayor, barring some weird April 4 miracle. But two, she's coming in to a clearly changing city, a changing Board of Aldermen, a changing electorate. If you look at both Kim Gardner's win as the first black woman to be the circuit attorney who won last November, you look at Tashara closing the gap, and closing the gap in a year in which there were multiple black candidates, and the thought was that that they would all split their votes and the white candidate would walk in. But the fact is, Tashara Jones attracted a large amount of votes from South City progressives and areas, wards that normally went. I specifically looked the other day at the 10th ward, which is in the Hill. 81% went for Slade during the last election. 49% went for Lyda Krewson. So it's to some degree losing by winning. She won, but now she inherits a city that has a changing electorate and a changing Board of Aldermen, and it's going to be really interesting to see how she reaches out to the Tashara Jones voters and how she manages the Board of Aldermen, because she's not going to be able to just automatically walk in with the 15 votes that Mayor Slay often had. And the other thing that's going to happen is the race for Board of Aldermen president has already begun. Lewis Reed, because he finished third in this race, now has a target on his back and will clearly be facing at least one opponent and probably multiple opponents. And much as how everything in the Board of Aldermen over the last few months was under this cloud of the mayor's race, the race for the Board of Aldermen president is going to sort of cloud over everything that happens when the board comes back in April.
I think you're right. Tashara Jones, I think, did surprise many people because she was kind of, compared to Antonio French and Lewis Reed, kind of the underdog in a way. But it is really surprising that she had such broad support as opposed to, like you were saying, Lyda Krewson, who really had little or no support from like areas in North County. What do you think?
Well, and the other thing you have to look at is if you talk to people that were at Tashara Jones's party, and you look at social media, and I think social media matters to some degree. It can be exaggerated, but if you look at that and you look at the donor base, Tashara Jones's voters had an energy to them that is the kind of thing that political operatives look back at and say, wow, that really matters. If you go back to Bruce Franks' win, in terms of having to go to court and defeat the absentee problems and then coming back and winning, that sort of energy, some of those voters, Bruce Franks endorsed Tashara Jones. So did Jason Kander, who is now an up-and-coming national Democrat. And so when you look at that kind of energy, that's the kind of stuff that really matters to people that are paid to win elections. And so Krewson's operatives, her people, the people advising her, are going to have to look at that voting base and look at those numbers and say, we have an issue if we don't find a way to connect to some of those voters and connect to the aldermen who are supported by those voters if we're going to want to pass legislation through the Board of Aldermen.
Case in point, you were talking about that energy. I live in District 9, and Ken Ortman was the only incumbent who was unseated by Dan Gunther.
Yeah, there's been, if you look at the Board of Aldermen, two different, the last two cycles, there's been one incumbent defeated, Kara Spencer 2 years ago, and Dan Gunther this year were the ones who defeated Ken. I think it was Ken Ortman in both cases. But similar parts of the city, sort of that Cherokee Street area that is growing, that has some business potential, that has a high, diverse and dense population. That's a part of the city that is gaining in electoral influence. And that is something to watch as Lyda Krewson becomes the next mayor and figures out what coalition she's going to have to forge in order to get legislation passed.
We'll be looking for your next column in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Tony Messenger, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having us. Good to talk to you.